Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Dravidian Does History. I'm once again joined by my beautiful friend Alan. Say hi, Alan.
Hi.
So, last episode we were halfway through discussing and going through a Q&A of the period under discussion, the Vedic Age of India, when the earliest kingdoms and states in India formed in what is today the area between eastern Afghanistan and Bangladesh and Kashmir and the Vindhya Mountains. Detailed discussion of this geography is in the previous video. If you want to take a look, it'll be somewhere on the screen right now. Today, we'll continue discussion of how the Brahminic system came into existence and became the hegemony in northern India during this time. And we were discussing the origins and the expansion of the Mahabharata, the legendary epic Sanskrit poetry that is a vital living part of India even today. Every child in India has heard of it. Most of us have seen it or read it, and we know the story. But how did it came to be, and how did it influence what became Hinduism in its earliest phase? How are you today, Alan?
Amazing.
Yeah. So I gave you a little bit of a homework last time when I asked you to think about why the usurping side of the Mahabharata winning influenced the evolution of the text and influenced the evolution of the Vedic religion itself, right? So did you come up with any ideas why that those two are linked together and why I think that is how it happened?
Um, I think it has something to do with maintaining the hierarchy.
It does. But it's
Um,
yeah.
no, go ahead.
But it's also an
That's
example
what.
for opportunism and a trend that will continue, particularly in Indian history, the Indian history of monarchies throughout the ages. So, opportunism is because one side of the dynasty saw that aligning yourself with a powerful religious or socio-cultural element would help in legitimizing your hold on the throne, and you can use the propaganda of poetry and religiosity together and the gods and telling their stories to influence the perception of your dynasty and your legitimacy among the people. So the side who won the battle of the Bharata, which evolved into the poem that is the Mahabharata 1,000 years later, were the Pandavas, and their successors, Janamejaya and Parikshit, helped establish the Kuru kingdom as the dominant force in northern India during this time by aligning themselves with the Vedic religion and the Vedic gods and the rituals associated with it. We will see the same trend of a side who wants to establish their dynasty and their kingdom as the premier kingdom in India by aligning themselves with different gods or religious traditions during different points of time. In future episodes, we'll discuss the Mauryas, where Ashoka aligned himself with Buddhism and the concept of dharma to form the empirical idea of what the Magadhan Empire, which had grown into this behemoth by the middle of the 3rd century BCE. He used dharma and Buddhism for that. Later, the Guptas aligned themselves with the evolving Puranic religion, where newer gods like Krishna and Rama and all of these gods were used to emphasize their power and authority and use the Brahminical system once again after a long period of shamanic traditions taking over and holding imperial power. Then during the Middle Ages, so roughly from 7th to about 13th century CE, not BCE, Common Era, we see kingdoms like the Shatavahanas or the um, uh, Rashtrakutas or the Chalukyas and even the Cholas of southern India, using even later traditions like the building of grand imperial temples and the Shaivite and Vaishnavite schools of Hinduism to align themselves to these religious traditions that were bubbling up, and the Bhakti tradition in particular to be used as ways to exonerate themselves from their imperial exercise, but also showcasing their wealth and power. And later still, another example would be Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj in the 17th century, when he realized that he could establish a kingdom in the Maratha regions in opposition to the Muslim empire of the Mughals, used Vedic rituals uh, like the Hiranyagarbha to establish himself as a Kshatriya king, even though their background is quite removed from that idea, to establish the Hindu Rajya. And later again, still in the 18th and 19th century, in southern Kerala, in Travancore, where Martanda Varma, who was a Nair, used Vedic rituals to associate himself with the Padmanabhaswamy temple and establish himself as a Hindu king, even though he used violence against other Hindus to establish that kingdom. But he used Vedic rituals and the Padmanabhaswamy temple to associate his kingship and elevate himself above the others. And we also see this exact same narrative in the Persianate period as well, which will be discussed in later. In detail in future episodes, maybe 10 or 15 episodes down the line when I start writing my second book. So that's why I wanted to bring that to your attention. So the Mahabharata story is a great example of how this tradition goes back from right at the beginning of the imperial period of India. And that's also why, if you read the text, you see why the usurping side won. Because if you look at the document itself, it is very clear that the bloodline that continued with Pandavas and Parikshit and Janameja has no links with the earlier Kuru kingdom because their father was not Pandu himself. Their parent, the father, were all the gods, which reeks to me of justification. Divine origins is always a justification for some other lack that might be in the actual historical record. It's a way to whitewash the actual story. At least that's my perspective on it. If you think about it, it makes sense. So maybe everybody in the audience, maybe you can think more about it too, right? And if you think about it, the Kauravas or the Kurus, which is after whom the kingdom was named, um, were directly descended from Dhritarashtra and his wife Gandhari, and they were apparently born out of mamsa pindas or pieces of meat. I don't know what that's trying to symbolize, but I'm not going into theology. But again, they're direct bloodlines. Discuss. And I'll go into more detail in my book itself because, again, it's a podcast. We don't have 7 days to discuss the same topic. So I was wondering if you had more questions for me about this period, my dear friend Alan.
What else? Can you talk about the art, the situation of art and culture during that period of time? Like where were, like, from the caveman drawings to
So
what
again,
we have
because
today.
India is so
There were
huge,
temples and stuff, right? Like for the
no, there
gods.
were no temples at
Oh,
this period of time. So
oh,
that's a great misunderstanding of the people of India today. And especially if you've grown up watching Mahabharata on TV shows and stuff, you see these grand imperial palaces and temples and them calling out to Vishnu and all of these gods, when in reality, the people who lived during the Vedic period would not have called out to Vishnu or Shiva or Krishna or any of these gods because the Vedic period, the gods were earlier gods, earlier Vedic deities, like Indra, Varuna, Agni, and all of these ancestral gods. And the gods that we are familiar with, called Vishnu and Narayana and Shiva, were later gods who were amalgamated with earlier versions of other gods, and several streams of gods came together to claim the mythology, which evolved over from roughly the Gupta period right until the 17th century. Some Puranas were written during that period. So that's what we think of as modern Hinduism evolved during that period. And Manu S. Pillai has written a fantastic book regarding the latest portion of it when Hinduism came in contact with missionaries in his latest book, Gods, Guns, and Missionaries. In my book, I discuss the evolution of the temple culture up until the 13th century. But temples didn't come into existence during the Vedic period. In the Vedic period, worship was focused on the holy sacred fires. So if you go to a Hindu household, if you build a new house, you always have a griha pravesha. Or if you go to Kodamangalam, what they call is Perekere Kudal, which always sounded like somebody trying to haunt a house. Right? So if any Hindu household, when you build a new house, you have a sacrificial pyre created with bricks, and then the Brahmin priest comes in, and in the sacred fire they chant things and offer offerings like rice and ghee and aromatic spices and stuff like that, and they chant these Vedic mantras, which are thousands of years old. The tradition has continued even today. So that was the primary form of worship for these Vedic people. They did not have temples. They did not have places where they went to worship these gods. The gods were thought of as elemental and existing at all times, but the only way to access these gods and to propitiate them was through the channeling of the sacred fires through the person of the Brahmin. And also within homes, tinier versions of this would have taken place through the Grihanatha, or the dominant male figure in the house, the father figure or the grandfather figure. He would have been the Grihastha who would be responsible for the sacrifices and the rituals held within the home. But again, they were revolved around sacred fires. And what we consider like idol worship evolved at a much later stage, and the influence of other cultural elements would be discussed on how the temple culture evolved and how it came to be. So, again, no temples during the Mahabharata period. Culturally, we don't have much surviving from this period because, again, unlike contemporary societies in the world during this period, we did not have any grand imperial structures up until the building of the cities like Rajagriha and Pataliputra in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, and after the decline of the Indus Valley civilization. The Indus Valley civilization had uniform cities and huge buildings like the Great Bath. But again, these were not imperial structures, these were not religious structures, and these were not kingly structures showing authority. Nothing of the scale of what was happening in ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia was happening in India during this time. The people lived in what, if you go to northern India, if you go to a regular old village, or if you turn on the movie Lagan, the houses that you see in that, those would have been rich people houses at this period of time. Everything was built out of perishable materials like wood and thatched roofs or mud bricks. People were reusing the mud bricks from the dead Indus Valley civilization and using those to build newer houses, which continued up until the 1920s, when that's how the British discovered there was a civilization, because they were building railways and they found these perfectly built bricks, which was not being built by any of the people there. And they were like, how did these bricks come to be? And they dug a little bit and like, oh my Jesus, there is a ancient civilization here. That's how it is discovered it. So everything that the Vedic people were building was built out of timber and other perishable materials, which has not survived to a great extent today. But recent digs has found material from later Vedic period, from around the 6th to 7th century BCE, remains of the city of Patliputra, the walls of the city, pillared halls, but only the bases of the pillars have been discovered. So by that period, grand imperial structures start to be built, but again, mostly in perishable materials or with perishable rocks like sandstone and stuff like that, which didn't last in the Indian climate particularly for a really long time. And culturally, again, it was based around cattle herding and then agriculture, and then the Iron Age had come in. So iron tools were being used. This is associated in the archaeological terms with what is called the painted gray ware culture, which is an academic term for the kind of pottery that is discovered from this period. So that gives you an idea of what is surviving from this period. We have to label the period based on the pottery shards that are discovered from this period. So we don't have anything resembling the pyramids or the Sphinx or even later temples from like Abu Simbel or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. Nothing equivalent to that existed in India during this period at all. I hope that clears up that question. So since I got into discussing ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia anyway, I'll continue that thread, right? So
Yes.
recently I did a poll on my Instagram page, and one of my friends asked if ancient India or ancient Egypt was older. And the answer, it's fairly simple, is that ancient Egypt is considerably older than ancient India if you look at any kind of historical and scientific evidence. For example, ancient Egypt is contemporaneous with the Indus Valley civilization for most of Indus Valley civilization's history. And Mesopotamia is also relatively contemporary to that as well. And these are considered the cradles of human civilization, where great human civilization originated. But the difference is that the Indus Valley civilization, the peak of it, the mature Harappan period is somewhere around 2500 BCE to 1900 BCE. That mathematics, 600 years, those 600 years is considered the mature period of the ancient Harappans, and then they went into decline. And by roughly 1300, when the Indo-Aryan language speakers come into India, they had vanished from the historical record, mostly, right? But if you look at Egypt, ancient Egypt, for example, and again, we haven't deciphered the language of the Indo-Aryans, we don't have any imperial structures, we don't have any religious structures. Think about that. But if you go to ancient Egypt, the story is entirely different. By around 4000 BCE, is when the early proto-dynastic period begins in ancient Egypt, roughly. They had already recognized kings and small states within what is the Nile Delta and the Nile River Valley itself by about 4000 BCE. So, about 1500 years before the Harappans achieved their great height, right? And by around 3000 BCE, again 500 years before the mature Harappan period, the first great king of Egypt that we know of comes into actual written archaeological record. And I do mean written. The hieroglyphic literature and the language and the script of the ancient Egyptians had become so advanced that it was recognizable by 3000 BCE. And we know of King Narmer, who united Upper and Lower Egypt into one state.
BCE.
Yeah, so about 3000 years before Christ. And then, by the mature Harappan period that we're familiar with, which is the oldest existing civilization in India that we know of, uh, we reach the Old Kingdom period of Egypt when the pyramids start to go up. About a century, like 2600 BCE to 2500 BCE, the pyramids are being built, meaning that they had already understood the kingship over a large surface area, and their technology had advanced far enough to be able to build giant structures like the pyramids. And they had the Egyptians originated kingship as we understand it in the world. Monarchy as a concept originated in Egypt, and and God did they know how to do it, because these were not kings who were opposed by their people. Their everyday lives were based on the gods who were kings. There was no separation of gods and kings in the case of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs. So it was easier to direct people to spend their lives to the glory of these kings, to spend their entire lives in servitude to these kings and build these grand monuments for 20 to 30 years. Ancient Egyptian kings like Khufu and Khafre, who built the Great Pyramids in Cairo today, it took 20 to 30 years, and people spent their whole lives building these grand monuments because the whole idea of Egypt itself as a society being linked directly to the success of these kings had been established for about 1,000 years by this point. In India, contemporaneously, Indus Valley civilization was at its peak, but there were no great kings, there were no grand imperial structures. And if you come to the Vedic period, which is again 1,000 years after the building of the pyramids, so roughly 1500 BCE and then onwards, that's when the new kingdom comes into existence. So that's the period when we have people like Tutankhamun and Ramesses II and Nefertiti, these famous Egyptian figures. They are themselves removed by almost 1,000 years from their ancestors like Khufu and Khafre. So it's one straight line of several dynasties converging and separating and converging and separating. But that idea of pharaonic kingship and the hieroglyphic language and that unified Egyptian culture continues for all these 3,000 years up until it is ended during the reign of Cleopatra the seventh, and she is the last pharaoh. So again, from about 4000 BCE to about, let's say, 100 BCE, roughly, you know, that's when ancient Egypt ends.
Almost 3,900 years.
Yeah, continuous with different dynasties like 20, 24, 20, yeah, roughly 24, 25, 26, depending on which version of the dynasties you want to take. All these dynasties, one after the other. Nothing like that existed in India before or afterwards. So there's no comparison. Ancient Egypt is definitely older. It was far more sophisticated at a far earlier stage. The very fact that they were able to build these grand imperial structures and have the idea of pharaohs be so significant that the people were willing to sacrifice their lives for these kings, and it was understood that that was for the good of the society. That gives you an idea of how powerful these people were, and the whole idea of the hieroglyphic language system and the script being existing because they built it out of nothing. They might have been slightly influenced by the cuneiform of the Babylonian, the Mesopotamians, but again, they evolved it themselves. They based it on their surroundings. The script is entirely Egyptian, and it continued and evolved for about 3,000 years, by which time India didn't have any written texts still.
What was happening in India at that point?
The Vedic period, right? From the Indus Valley, to the later Vedic period. So about 600 BCE, 500 BCE, ancient Egypt is still continuing as the same thing, essentially. Dynasties may change, the kings who ruled may change, the way they worship the different gods may change, but the foundational culture itself was very uniform and continued almost essentially the same. Because when you think about ancient Egypt, the things that you think of, right? The idea of the pharaoh as a god king, the hieroglyphic language, the symbols, the regular flooding of the Nile River, the grand imperial structures like the pyramids and the great temples, and the names that you think of. If you think about Ramesses II and Khufu and Khafre, you essentially see the same image, even though they are about 2000 years apart. But if you think about somebody who lived 2000 years ago in Indian history, for example, a Kushana king or even Chandragupta Maurya, he doesn't look anything like we do or Narendra Modi does, right? These are two imperial figures, technically, essentially doing the same role. Chandragupta Maurya and Narendra Modi. It's only 2000 years apart, but how different are these versions of power? But for Egyptians, ancient Egyptians, it was essentially the same throughout this whole period. That's how uniform and centralized it was. Nothing like that ever existed in India or China, or even Mesopotamia. But Egypt was that unified and that centralized and that, you know,
Advanced.
continuous for such a long time. So there's no comparison.
Um, so one question that came up
Yes.
was, is there anything mentioned about the um, pyramids or the ancient Egypt in any of Indian history? Like, when was the first mention of the pyramids or about Egyptian civilization, if there was any?
Unfortunately, there are no records whatsoever. The ancient Indians, and I'm by ancient Indians, I'm referring to the people who, particularly the Indo-Aryans, from 1300 BCE to our period of 500 BCE, they were not aware directly of any of the other societies that existed in the world at the time. There is evidence to support that the Indus Valley civilization itself had trade relations with Mesopotamia and Egypt because these were the most civilized societies in the world at the time, and they were reasonably within traveling distance from each other, particularly through sea, because the Indus Valley civilization had what the seaports in what is today Pakistan. On the Indus River, going into the Arabian Sea in that region, they were able to travel up the Red Sea to ancient Egypt through there. And again, overland, they could connect to Mesopotamian cities. And we have examples of ancient Indus and Harappan seals and other material found in ancient Egyptian sites and Mesopotamian sites. And again, in records from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, because they had active writing systems at this time, there are mentions of a land called Meluha, which is equated with the Harappan civilization, and mentions of animals and such represented in their historical documentation. So there was obviously trade and connections there, but nothing of the sort is available during what is the Vedic period, because they were basically an insular society, and they did not have the technological advancement to be able to connect a society so far away. But there is also a reality that trade relations continued between smaller communities in India with ancient Egypt and possibly even Mesopotamia. Because we have to remember that, again, India wasn't a unified society at any point in this time, right? So even though the Indo-Aryan people never discuss any of these ancient Egyptians or Mesopotamians in any of the documents, we have archaeological evidence to support the idea that the ancient Egyptians still traded with the coastal towns and communities in the western coast of India. For example, Kerala and what is Gujarat and that area maintained trade contacts with the societies in the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf. But it wasn't a state to state contact, it was individual societies to an imperial state. So there are connections, but the Indo-Aryan literature, at least, is not at all aware of these ancient civilizations that existed during this time. Because think about it this way. Imagine somebody from the Andaman and Nicobar Sentinel tribes suddenly seeing aeroplanes landing in their beaches and coming into contact with, somebody like us. They will be horrified and they will actually evidently try to document it in their language, right? because we are so advanced in their eyes. That would have been the situation if um, that would have been the situation in which the people of the Indo-Aryan language speaker communities would have been in this situation. Right? So that's how the situation was. There was no real contact with the different cultures at this time. But that would change in the next few centuries when we come into roughly around the middle of the first millennium with the emergence of new states in India, with actual kingdoms coming into existence. Trade starts to take off at an imperial scale. And by the time we reach the Mauryas, we have actual contacts with the rest of the world. For the first time, Indian ideas are taken out of the subcontinent and travel the world. And
Mm.
that's really the birth. India as a global superpower begins. And India remains a global superpower for another 2000 years, roughly, from roughly around 600 BCE to at least 1800 CE. But if we want to really look at it, at least 1700 CE, India remains a global superpower. And that phase begins with the enthronement of the Mauryas in Magadha. And that's a story all of itself, and we can discuss it in detail. I think the Vedic period, I think we have discussed it enough. I don't want to bore people with more and more and more and more, but there are resources available if you want to get more information about it. First and foremost, I will plug my book, The Lords of India, The Evolution of Imperial Identity from Ajatashatru to Alamgir, because it gives a concise history of this period in the first two chapters. But there are further resources, again, as I mentioned in a previous video. Abraham Ereli's book, The Gem in the Lotus, is a fantastic read. It's a very simple, very straightforward text that gives you a great idea of the early phase of Indic kingship. If you want to learn more about Egypt, there is a book by Toby Wilkinson, which I am currently rereading, which I think is, again, a great resource if you want to learn a little bit about the ancient Egyptians. But of course, everybody knows ancient Egyptians, right? I'll give you a little bit of a nugget before we leave. So everybody knows Tutankhamun, right? The great Egyptian king. The only reason people know about Tutankhamun is because his grave was robbed by the British instead of ancients. In his own lifetime, he was kind of a failure because his rule comes at a very interesting period in ancient Egyptian history. So Egypt had existed as a great state for a few thousand years at this time. And then comes to the throne a king called Akhenaten. He had a different name before, but he chose to call himself Akhenaten because he redirected the attention of the Egyptian kingship and worship towards this new sun god called Aten, Aten, Aten. Right? In Indic, we would call it Aten, not Satan, it's Aten. And he and his wife, Nefertiti, reoriented Egyptian culture towards the worship of the sun god and defunded all the other worship, all the other temples for all the other gods. So Amun, the previous most important god, was left on the sides. So the priests were again very unhappy about it. The people were very unhappy about it. And again, they ushered in a new era of artistic representation as well. The Egyptian liked to paint themselves and depict themselves in a perfect form. So that's why they're always in profile. Face always in profile, body not in profile, legs in profile. So that's how they depicted themselves as perfections. But Akhenaten and Nefertiti differed from it and showed their ordinariness with sagging chests and huge bulging bellies and all that. So if you look at Akhenaten and Nefertiti's images, it is shown that way. It's very different from the previous era. And Nefertiti is considered the most gorgeous woman in the ancient world because of a bust that was discovered. I actually have a copy of the bust here, which I'll show in the next video. I don't want to leave for now. Maybe I'll post a picture of it in the video when I post it. But I have a replica
I'm
of the
sorry, for
bust
the
itself.
audience and me, whose bust do you have in your room?
Nefertiti, the queen of Akhenaten. And I don't mean this bust,
Hmm.
it's a bust. This is a bust.
Oh,
So, but
okay.
Tutankhamun was their successor, and he reoriented Egyptian worship back to the god Amun, because Tutankhamun was originally called Tutankhaten. But then when he became king, he went back to the old ways and changed his name to Tutankhamun, saying, Praise be to the god Amun, and brought the traditional ways back. But again, Tutankhamun was very ill. He had possibly had scoliosis and might have had a bent back and didn't live long. He only ruled for a few years and died in his childhood, basically teenage years. And his funerary site itself was not particularly rich compared to his predecessors or successors, but because it is the only one that survived to the modern age, almost intact, that's why he's famous. And again, he's shown as perfection in his death mask, the golden painted masks that we are so familiar with. But he didn't look anything like that in his actual life because, but he was shown as perfection because he had brought back that kind of representation into Egyptian art again after the slight anomaly of the Akhenaten period. I think it's called the Amarna period because that's where the main temple for Aten was. And again, they were kind of erased from Egyptian history for a few centuries until they were rediscovered. That's when Nefertiti is such a popular figure in ancient Egyptology and in popular culture as well. That bust of hers, if you can Google Nefertiti, you will see why she is considered the most gorgeous woman in the ancient world, until Cleopatra comes along, at least. So I think we have covered everything we want to cover about that period from roughly 1300 BCE to once again 500 BCE, the Vedic period of India, when the earliest forms of kingship formed in India, the first dynasties came into existence. I'm tired. My English is not so great today. Me not so speak so good. And then the Vedic Brahmanic culture became the central hegemony, and the Vedas as texts became popular, and the Shrauta rituals became embedded, and the Varnashrama Dharma system became embedded, particularly in northern India. But all of this will change with the coming of two teachers in particular and the rise of the Magadhan hegemony around the 5th and 6th centuries BCE. But that's the topic for another video. Until then, I hope everyone has a great time. Enjoy all the videos and enjoy looking at mine and Alan's face. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.